Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lesson, we will be looking at sexual and asexual reproduction in plants. The objective of this lesson, at the end of this lesson, you should be able to distinguish or tell the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction. So here's a quick comparison or a short comparison between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. For asexual reproduction, one parent is needed, whereas in sexual reproduction, two parents are needed. In asexual reproduction, the cells divide by fission, or you call it binary fission, meaning that you have one single cell, and that cell divides into two cells. And each of the cells that are now formed are identical to one another. Other ways in which the cells divide would include budding and regeneration. In sexual reproduction, the cells divide by a process called meiosis. We'll look at meiosis in another lesson. Asexual reproduction is said to be time efficient, meaning that it occurs very quickly. There's no need to search for a mate and requires less energy. For example, in plants, the offspring can often go out of the parent plant. So the parent plant does not have to go search for a mate. Whereas in sexual reproduction, it takes time for the offspring to form. If you're looking at plants, well, then the plants would have to produce its pollen grains. The pollen grains will have to find a stigma. The pollen grains will have to reach the ovary. So there are many processes that are involved in sexual reproduction in plants, and this will cause it to take more time for the offspring to be formed. In asexual reproduction, there is no variation, meaning that the offspring that you have are identical in appearance and identical genetically as well. One of the disadvantages of this is that if there's a disease that is present, let's say in an area, all of the plants in that area will be destroyed because all of them don't have the resistant genes. However, in sexual reproduction, the offsprings are not often, but they're always different from the parents. So there's variation. So if you have a land with a number of plants there, well then some of those plants may have the gene to protect them against disease. So if there's a disease, perhaps you may lose 50% of the plants, but the other 50% of the plants, because of variation, they can resist the disease. All right, so from the next section of this lesson, we will be looking at sexual reproduction. In another lesson, we will focus on asexual reproduction. So that before there, the slide before, that was a short comparison between sexual and asexual reproduction. There are other comparisons that you can add to the list that you were just shown. So flower. The flower is a sexual organ of the plant and is used for reproduction. There are some flowers that contain both the male and the female parts, and we call those flowers hermaphrodite. However, a lot of plants also, some of the plants, they have separate male and female flowers. An example of that would be pumpkin plants. So what we are going to look at here is the structure, or the structure of a typical flower. Some flowers will look a little different from the one that you are currently shown. So at the top, we have the stigma. We have the stigma at the top. And moving down, we have the style. And on the right side, we're looking at the different structures there. And we have the ovary. So those three structures, collectively, we call them the pistil. And the pistil is referred to as the female reproductive structures. The function of the stigma is going to attract the pollen grain. The pollen grain will land on the stigma and it will go into a pollen tube, which will carry the nuclei that are needed for fertilization to occur. The style will facilitate the movement of the pollen grain down into the ovary. And in the ovary, that's where you have the egg cells. So moving on to the left side of your screen, we have the pollen tube. The pollen tube will go after pollination would occur. Pollination is when the pollen lands on a stigma, and then the pollen tube will start to go downwards. Next, we have the anther and the filament. And together, the anther and the filament are called the stamen. And you should know by now that the stamen is the male reproductive structure of the flower. Going back there, the anther, that's where the pollen grains are produced. Next, we have the petals. Now, collection of petals, all of the petals together, we refer to that as a corolla. The petals are different in different type of flowers. For example, in wind-pollinated flowers, the petals are not brightly colored, whereas in insect pollinated flowers or flowers that rely on animals to allow them to be pollinated, the colors are usually attractive to attract insects and the different pollinators. Then we have the ovule, which is found inside of the ovary. We have the receptacle, the sepal, and a collection of the sepal is called the calyx. And we have the pedicel, or sometimes referred to as the stalk. So those are the main external structures of a flower that you should be able to identify. And furthermore, you should be able to state the function of each one of those structures that are stated on this slide. Now we're going to look at some of the differences between a wind-pollinated flower and an insect-pollinated flower. So for the wind-pollinated flower, they are odorless. And this makes sense. They would not invest energy into producing scents when they do not need those scents, because they rely on wind to move their pollen grain from one location to another. They do not have nectar as well, because again, they do not rely on insects or any animal to allow them to be pollinated. In insect pollinated flowers, they are usually sweet scented and they produce nectar. Again, the sweet scent and the nectar is to attract insects. They're to attract different pollinators. So the pollinators will go to the flower. Because of the sweet scent, they will go to use the nectar. And as they leave the flower, they would leave with some of the pollen grains, and then they will go to another flower and pollinate the other flower. In terms of the pollen grain, the wind-pollinated flower, their pollen grain is smooth. They're small and they're lightweight. And all of these are features that will allow the pollen grain to move easily in the wind. If it had rough edges, then it will not move very easily in the wind. If they're heavy, then the wind cannot take them very far. The pollen grains in insect pollinated flowers, these are large. They're large and they stick onto the body of the insects or the animal that may be feeding on it. And they have sticky surfaces, and sticky surfaces will allow them to stick onto the body of the insect or whichever animal, maybe a bird that is feeding on the flower. For wind-pollinated flowers, you often find that the stigma is feathery. And you should imagine why. Because if it's feathery, it means that when the pollen grain is moving in the wind, the pollen grain can easily be trapped on the feathery structure of the stigma. Whereas in insect pollinated flowers, the stigma is usually smooth and sticky. The final comparison that I have here to discuss is that the stigma and the anther of the wind pollinated flower is outside of the flower. So when you look at the flower, you would see these structures clearly. You do not have to look inside of the flower or inside of the petal to see the stigma and the anther. So that's one indication that the flower is wind pollinated. And on the other hand, for the insect pollinated flower, the stigma and the anther is usually found within the petals or inside of the flower, if you want to term it like that. And that is because when the insects go inside the flower, they will touch these parts, they will touch the anther, and the pollen grains will get onto their body. And when they leave the flower, they will leave along with those pollen grains and take it to another flower. So I have here three different images of 3 different flowers, and you should be able to identify whether they are wind pollinated flowers or if they are insect pollinated flowers. How about the top one, the top flower? As you can see, the anther and the stigma, they are outside of the flower, of the main part of the flower. And this is an indication that it is wind pollinated. The next flower on the bottom right, you can see that the anther and the stigma, they are inside of the flower, inside or enclosed within the petal. And at the bottom, you have the nectary. That's where the nectar is. So the insect will have to pass and pass the anther and pass the stigma in order to get to the nectar. So as they pass, they will collect some of the pollen grain onto their body, and as they leave, they will also be collecting some pollen grains. And if they come with pollen grains from other flower, well, then the pollen grains can get attached to the stigma. Oh, and the other flower, as you can figure out as well, it's wind pollinated flower. You can see the anther and you can see the stigma out of the flower. The feathery stigma is there and the anther is there. All right, so we have been talking about pollination because I assume that you would have some prerequisite knowledge regarding pollination already. So you should be able to define it, and pollination is the transfer or movement of pollens from the anther to the stigma. Pollination is very essential. It's essential for the production of crops. If you have more pollination, well, then you will have greater yields because through pollination, you have fruit formation. So it's essential that pollination occur. So if there are less pollinators in an area, well, then food production can be affected. There are 2 main types of pollination: self-pollination. And the main thing to remember about self-pollination is that it occurs on the same plant. So in self-pollination, you can have the pollen grains moving from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Or alternatively, you can have the pollen grain moving from the anther to the stigma of another flower, but on the same plant. So you may have an insect feeding on a particular flower, then it moves to another flower on the same plant and it carries that pollen grain. So when that pollen grain is transferred, that's self-pollination. Self has to do with the same plant. Then we have cross-pollination. And cross-pollination, this occurs on different plants. So obviously it means 2 different flowers. So you have one flower on one plant. The insect may come and feed on that plant, or through wind it can occur as well. And then it takes the pollen grain to another flower on a different plant. So that's the difference between self and cross-pollination. And finally, we will look at fertilization. The fertilization that occurs in flowering plants is also referred to as double fertilization. And you will understand why it's called double fertilization after we go through the steps that are involved in fertilization. So first of all, the stigma is pollinated with pollen grains. As you can see in the diagram there at the top, you have the pollen grain landing on the stigma. That's the first step that occurs. Then a pollen tube goes down the style. 3 nuclei. So there are 3 nuclei that are present at the tip or at the end of the pollen tube. One of them is the pollen nuclei. And what we are also mostly interested in is the 2 male nuclei. The pollen tube enters the ovary through the micropyle. So you should look at the diagram and you should see at the bottom right, a structure there is labeled as a micropyle. Micropyle is a small opening or a small hole that allows the pollen tube to enter. And as it enters, it brings the nuclei, the male nuclei, 2 of the male nuclei. A single one is called nucleus, and plural will be nuclei. So one male nucleus, okay, so one of the male nucleus, it will fuse with the egg cell or the female gamete. And this will form the zygote. the zygote, and then another male nucleus will fuse with the nuclei in the ovule, and this will form the food storage. So the ovule, where fertilization will occur also, where the second male nuclei will fuse, the ovule will develop into the seed, whereas the ovary, that will develop into the fruit. So once again, the ovule develops into the seed, and the ovary, that develops into the fruit. So I mentioned at the beginning that you call this double fertilization. So you should understand this clearly now. You have two nuclei, so that's where the double come from, and one of them will fuse with the egg cell in the female gamete, and the other will fuse with the nuclei in the ovule. So to summarize, you have the pollen grain landing on the stigma. Pollen tube then develops and carries the two male nuclei, and it goes towards the ovary and enters through the micropyle, and one of them fuse with the ovule, and one of them fuse with the female gamete. So that's basically what occurs during fertilization. So this brings us to the end of this lesson. As always, if you have any questions regarding the contents that were discussed, please do not hesitate to reach out and ask those questions. Until the next lesson, I wish you all of the best.